Hey there, and welcome back to Family Twist. I'm Corey, and today's story starts with a birthday gift that came with a really big surprise. Nick turned 36, and his siblings decided to give him one of those 23andMe DNA kits. You know, the kind that's supposed to tell you that you're 3% Viking or related to somebody who maybe once waved at George Washington. Instead, it told Nick something his parents had kept secret his entire life, that he's donor conceived. Now, his two younger siblings, same parents, same household, aren't donor conceived. But there's a twist there as well. Nick's parents carried their secret for decades, convinced by doctors back in the 80s that no one would ever find out, or need to find out. So when they finally told him, they expected anger, confusion, and maybe even rejection. But Nick surprised them. He stayed calm. He led with empathy. In the first part of Nick's story, he walks us through that moment. What it's like to have the truth land like a meteor in the middle of your life, and how he managed to turn shocking into understanding. We'll talk sperm washing, sperm mixing, and the unregulated chaos that was the fertility industry back then. And, spoiler alert, still that way. So just wait to hear what his DNA results uncovered, because 14 half-siblings later, the plot is just starting to thicken. Okay, let's talk to Nick. Hey, Nick, welcome to the Family Twist podcast.
Thank you guys for having me. Nice meeting you both.
Thank you. Nice to meet you as well, yeah. So we mentioned to you before we started recording that Kendall and I don't like to know too much about someone's story before we do these interviews. It's just that we found out kind of the hard way that's like if we know too much, it's just the real factor isn't there. So, I mean, we know a little bit about you, but you discovered you were donor conceived at 36. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So I'm 38 now. So this was a little over 2.5 years ago. And, like many other donor conceived people, it was the shock of my life. I did not see it coming whatsoever. And the way this all kind of came about was it was my 36th birthday, and my two younger siblings got me a 23andMe testing kit as a gift. And I had, I guess, expressed light interest in like understanding my ancestry, years before getting this as a gift. I never was like, oh, I got to know more about, where I come from and all that. But it had been brought up, a couple times, and I had said, yeah, that would be kind of cool. So at this point in my life, my two younger siblings take it upon themselves to get this for me. And when they do, I think it was my brother who let my mom know that they were planning to give this to me. And in that moment, she just froze. My brother kind of recalls her almost like going white, like turning into a ghost almost. My parents, I guess, behind the scenes discussed what was about to happen and that I was going to get this gift, and said, you know what, before Nick receives this, we have to talk to him. We have to sit him down. This actually applied to my brother as well, because he was conceived in the same fashion. So, which back in the late 80s, the way that this all went down was through sperm washing and then sperm mixing. So because of that mixing factor, I guess my parents had convinced themselves that there was the possibility that both I and my brother could be connected to our dad who raised us. Jumping ahead a little bit, it turns out my brother is actually biologically connected to our dad. So I think he sort of defied the odds in some ways. But needless to say, the conversations were had with both me and my brother separately with our parents. And the way they kind of expressed this was like I just said. They said there's a possibility. And my first thought when I got this news from my parents, and I could see the fear in them as we were having this conversation because they had no idea how I was going to react, was first off, this doesn't change anything in terms of our relationship. Obviously, there's potential for it to change how I'm connected biologically or not connected. But then I thought, how do you guys feel? For some reason, I put the focus on them because I knew that at 36 years old, they had been carrying this for my entire life, knowing that I think a lot of donor conceived people their parents know for sure that the child is donor conceived. In my parents' case, they held out hope, but they were still carrying this nonetheless and suppressing a very huge piece of information for my entire life. And I think after they saw that, you know, they had just dropped this bomb, and even in the earliest moments, despite being extremely confused, I was still accepting of what they were telling me. I could see just how much relief that provided them to know that I didn't storm out or anything. I didn't throw a hissy fit, and is for many donor conceived people. But for me, I didn't feel anger. And I'm still trying to figure out like exactly why that wasn't present. I've kind of come up with some answers to that. A lot of it has to do with the way I was raised. My parents, they have a very loving marriage. They're still married today. I really respected and admired the way they parented both me and my two siblings. And that kind of outweighed any potential negatively charged emotions that I could have felt. So, yeah, it was this heavy conversation that we had. And afterwards, I remember going upstairs and calling my brother. He had a similar conversation with my parents, and just checking in with him and saying like, "Hey, are you okay? Like, this is pretty crazy." Just, asking how he was feeling. And I don't really recall exactly much of that conversation because this was right after the news had been dropped on us. So like, it's quite blurry in my memory to think back on like what we actually said, but it was just the two of us kind of checking in and figuring out, all right, we're okay. But like, what does the path forward look like now? Because we still hadn't taken the tests. So part of it was almost like answering that question, like, do we take the test? And I remember the next morning just so clearly being like, of course I'm taking the tests. Like, I have to know all of the information I can get my hands on. And my brother, mostly for medical reasons, because he had a newborn at that time, was very clearly leaning towards taking the test. But I remember discussing with my parents, like, my decision and that I needed to know the results. And my mom, she kind of was in the position of like, well, the cat's out of the bag now. Like, what are we just going to pretend like this isn't real? Like, do what you got to do. My dad, on the other hand, expressed that he didn't feel he even needed to know the results, almost saying, if you take the test, like, don't tell me. And I thought, I am taking the test. I am getting these answers, and there's no way I can keep that from you. Like, part of how we got here is that there was this truth in the air that was never revealed. And if I get more answers towards what the truth actually is, like, I'm not going to follow that same path of just like suppressing it and keeping it on the inside. Like, we're going to talk about it. Yeah. I mean, that was a very clear path forward for me. Like, I knew, like, this is my story now. And not that I want to dictate how it goes forward, but like, the ball's in my hands now, essentially. And we can either figure out how to move forward together, or I'm going to do it on my own. And thankfully, it wasn't the easiest path towards getting to the point we're at now, where we're all completely open about it. But little by little, that was the only way. And my dad's initial resistance, I think, was based on the unknowing of when these results come back, if we are indeed not biologically connected, is that going to have a negative impact on our relationship? And I think he had a lot of fear around that. And the reality was, when the results came back and I find out I'm donor conceived, it actually strengthened our relationship because I became more grateful for the sacrifices and the selflessness that this whole process when I was being conceived came with.
Before we
Yeah.
dig into the results, just for some context, because you
Yeah.
mentioned one of your siblings also went through the similar process. Is it
Yeah.
your youngest sibling? Was the youngest sibling conceived the old-fashioned way?
So I have a younger brother. He's the one that was conceived in the same fashion I was. And then I have a younger biological sister. They're non-binary, but they were conceived naturally. Um, yeah.
So in that conversation with your parents, did they explain the circumstances as to why they would even have to go the potential for donor conception?
Yeah, and more of that came to light as time went on, but I had always known that it had taken a while for my parents to conceive. Like, they were it wasn't something they talked about, but there were mentions of that growing up, that, like, it took them 6 or 7 years. I'd later come to find out that they were considering adoption at one point. They explored adopting a child from South Korea, but, like, that didn't quite work with my dad's work schedule. The only answer in the end for them was donor conception. So they wanted to have a child so badly, but couldn't do it naturally. That's ultimately what they settled on, which, yeah, I mean, I know through talking to other donor conceived people that there's a lot of flaws and, you know, uh, just the unregulated industry that we come from really creates an environment where we don't really have justice and, like, have access to all the information that I think we rightly deserve. So, there's a lot of things that could be said in terms of, like, parents back then sort of ignoring or not being mindful of the struggle that could come from this. But
Right.
this is what my parents chose, and I'm thankful. It's why I'm here, and I choose to see the positives in it, despite knowing how, for lack of a better phrase, like, messed up the whole fertility industry is.
Right. And we totally understand the mindset of people who are like, desperate to have a child and there's, they can't do it the old fashioned way.
Right.
And, it's kind of like you're wearing horse blinders at that point. You're really not thinking about like medical history and all the stuff. You're just thinking about, we want to have a baby.
Yeah.
And, it's not common knowledge that the fertility industry is so messed up. It's starting to come to light a little bit and legislation is slowly starting to happen. But it's, most people don't have any idea. They just think like, oh, okay, well, great. That was, you're able to have a baby. I don't think we've ever really touched on, and Kimberly, correct me if I'm wrong, on sperm washing / sperm mixing. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about the process and how it was explained to your parents?
Yeah, so sperm washing, and again, I am just going based off of what my parents said and a little bit of Googling that I did afterwards. Sperm washing, I suppose, if it's even a process still done today, I don't know, would extract the strongest sperm from my dad. And then the sperm mixing aspect is taking those stronger sperm and blending them together with donor sperm. So it gives the parents, again, the hope, but in my brother's case, the reality that the child can still be related biologically to the father.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have to do some research on. I'm just kind of curious about statistics as to how frequently, that's
Yeah.
that's just such a bizarre thing to think about. Like, all right, let's mix your strongest sperm with this guy's strongest and see what.
Right. Right. Yeah. So that's the process that my parents opted for. And I think one of the biggest things that I wanted to figure out through all of this was, and again, many DCPs can relate to this, is why didn't my parents tell me? And a big part of why I've accepted the fact that they didn't tell me was because doctors, people who, back in the day, you would trust pretty much anything a doctor said. I think we have lost that a little bit these days. But back then, if a doctor told you, you never have to worry about this, like, don't say anything, there's no way that this can be uncovered, chances are the parents are going to listen to that. And it was really only until these DNA testing companies were starting to become more prevalent that my parents started having conversations with each other saying, oh, wait a minute, like, there may come a day where we need to address this. If a doctor, doctors told my parents, don't say anything, and they took that advice. And I think it's unfair to judge decisions from the past with the information that we have today. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we're
yeah,
not, we don't want to cast blame on parents at all, in
sure.
these types of circumstances. Now, the people in the industry, on the other hand, I mean, yeah,
Right.
they knew that some of the stuff they were doing was probably not very cool.
Right.
What's the age difference between you and your brother?
I am 2 years and 2 months older than him.
Did they use the same donor with him?
I actually don't know. I think the answer is no, but I'm not sure. I'm not positive.
Sure. Okay. I'm just curious. You would have been too young probably to be even asking questions and stuff. Like if they were going back to the same clinic or whatever, you're just a little,
Right.
not even two.
Yeah. But no, that's a really fair question that actually I think I'm going to ask my parents this now, because I talked to a lot of people who, their parents felt it was important that they use the same donor for multiple children that they have, just so there's that
Right.
commonality. And yeah, I never thought of that. I got to ask my parents that now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the stories we've heard about them nickel and diming people too, like, oh, well, this is an add-on if you want to know this. It's like, oh my gosh. It seems
Yeah.
cruel to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like late stage capitalism at its grossest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You take the test. And your brother, did he take a test as well?
He took the test about a week in advance of me. So he gets his results back, and they end up being somewhat inconclusive, which prompted him to take a direct one-on-one paternity test with our dad, which then showed that they are biologically connected. My test came through about a week later, and during the lead up time to getting the results, my brother and I are having conversations almost on a daily basis. I'm talking to my parents pretty regularly about all of this, like really trying to establish that like being open, no matter what, is the way to go. And I had sort of settled on the likelihood that my dad and I were not biologically connected. And really the main reason for that is physically we don't look much alike. I mean, you guys can see I have a pretty thick beard and dark hair. My dad is blonde hair, blue eyes, can't really grow a beard. Yeah, there's a number of like physical attributes that are just different. And beyond that, our personalities have some differences as well. So, yeah, I almost felt, I don't know, like spiritually, I was like, there's a good chance we're not connected. And I was okay with that. What I wasn't quite prepared for when my results came back was seeing what my ancestry composition actually consisted of, and then checking out the family tree. I grew up thinking I was half Irish, a quarter Italian, a quarter German. I get the results back, and at the very top, it says I'm almost 50% Ashkenazi Jewish, which right away, I was like, what? Didn't see that one coming at all. And then I very quickly thought back on my childhood and was like, I'm the only one in my family that went to a lot of bar and bat mitzvahs. Many of my friends growing up were Jewish. My brother and my younger sibling, that wasn't really the case. Even my parents, it wasn't really the case. And we grew up in a town that had, a decent amount of Jewish families. And I just was kind of fascinated by that like, even unknowingly, I still was connected to people who shared the same ancestry as me.
That's why we talk about nature and nurture a lot on the show. That is really, really interesting. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that quite like that before. And I mean, I knew what you were going to say before you even said what your results are going to be, just because it's so common. We've got so many of our guests have no idea of their Jewish heritage until they've taken the test.
Yeah. So that was quite the surprise for me. But then even more surprising was shifting over to the family tree. And the first thing I saw was, because my brother had taken the test already, I saw his name on there and it said half brother underneath. And I thought, that doesn't feel right. Like, what is that all about? But then I looked at the paternal side, and I forget exactly how many people showed up, but ultimately I'd come to find out that there's 13 additional half siblings. So 14 in total, including me, that I had never known about before. And yeah, just seeing that many names and that I was so closely connected to them, like just percentage wise with my DNA, I just kind of froze. Like I wasn't bothered by it, but I was just like, whoa, this changes everything. I have a lot of decisions to sit with and figure out like, okay, how is this going to factor into my life or not factor into my life? That morning when I got the results back, I had to go to work to my day job, which thankfully was remote at the time. So I went to the coffee shop that was nearby and sat down and tried to work, but that wasn't happening. Within an hour, I got a message from a half sister on 23andMe. In a very gentle way, she kind of explained like, "Hey, I'm not sure if you were aware of any of this information before today, but if and when you want to know more, I can share more with you." So I tried to mentally prepare myself for as much of this as I could. And in that
How can
moment,
you
I
though?
wrote, yeah, I mean, you can't, but like, you try your best. And right away, I wrote back and I was like, send me everything you got. Like, I'm ready for it. And that she did. She sent me 2 emails. The first one was kind of correspondence between her and one of the half brothers and sort of outlined all the detective work that went into uncovering the identity of the donor. The second email was basically a copy of an email from the donor because one of the half sisters had decided, you know what, I'm going to reach out and try to get whatever information I can. Somehow she dug up his email. I don't know how she guessed it correctly, but she did. And the donor wrote back and basically gave us all of the pertinent information about, parents, his grandparents, where they came from, any medical history that he felt was relevant. And that was the gist of it. He did kind of express like he never expected someone like this half sister to reach out, but with the advancements of technology, he accepts that, you know, this is where we're at now. And then he did at the end kind of request or at least state that he didn't really have any interest in fostering any relationships with any donor conceived people that came from him. But if and when there are more people that join our half sibling group, he basically gave us his blessing and permission to share this information with them and their respective families.
Did he
Yeah.
share any information about what the circumstances were around him donating?
He did not, but we were able to gather that he was doing his medical practice at the hospital where all of us were born. So I don't think it's uncommon to find med students who end up being the ones that are donating. And in
Yeah.
my case, that's how it turned out.
Did you end up going to one of your half siblings' bar bat mitzvah? Bet you know.
I think it's safe to say I did not. However, now that I've kind of established relationships with a few of them, we have kind of discussed like, where could we have crossed paths growing up? One of the half brothers literally lives streets away from where my parents now live in the town I grew up. So I'm sure we had crossed paths at some point. I know for a fact that one half sister and half brother, they used to go to the same like public swimming pool as kids. So like they're probably running around not knowing that they're related to each other. And yeah, I mean, for all of us to come from the same hospital and to grow up in Long Island, Long Island's, there's a lot of people that live here, but like there's a lot of chances for people to cross paths too. So I'm
Absolutely.
sure it happened a number of times growing up.
I mean, we're
Yeah.
definitely hearing about, especially when it's happening in the same region of half siblings dating and that's, and
Yeah.
beyond.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the really scary and sad part about the situation we find ourselves in is the fact that there's a greater than 0% chance of things like that legitimately happening is so wrong. It's almost hard to fathom that there hasn't been more progress and movement in the right direction. There's no excuse for something like that happening other than just
Right.
being greedy and wanting money. Like you said, like it's all profit driven.
Sure. And I could totally understand somebody wanting to maintain their anonymity too, because, if they conceive children with their half sibling or something like that. Like, that's not something that you just talk about casually.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take those types of stories and legislation to change.
Totally.
Nick, you may not know the answer to this, but I mean, the chances of the donor, starting his own family and having children is pretty strong. And, it's pretty common for people to take these tests now. So there's, like some of these half siblings might actually be from the donor and his wife.
Right. Which is the case in my situation. There are two. So of the 14 that I mentioned, 2 of them were raised by the donor. And the big question that I and the donor conceived half siblings have is, are they even aware of our existence? Because we're not connected to them on any of the DNA sites. We haven't had any correspondence with them. So my gut says that the donor's immediate family likely is aware of all of this, but we don't have any proof of that. And if for some reason they don't know about all of this, it's another instance of like suppressing very real and relevant information. And the chances of that information coming to light and being a bomb that's dropped, basically, as opposed to something that you have, a mindful discussion around, it just feels risky.
Yeah.
Tell the people you're closest to.
Right. Yeah. And if he goes and says like, don't ever take an ancestry test, what's the first thing you're going to do is take an ancestry test to find out why his dad not wanting to take one. At least that's what I would do.
Yeah. I've thought about all the ins and outs of all of this. And I forget if I mentioned, I ended up writing a book about my story. And part of what I speculate on is like, if I'm one of those 2 kids that the donor raised himself, and I knew that I had other half siblings out there, wouldn't I want to have direct access to that information myself via a DNA test, rather than having to rely on, in my donor's case, an extended family member who is the one that happens to be connected to us on 23andMe? To me, like if I were in their shoes, the donor's children's shoes, I would want to take a test. So like, I'm not relying on anyone else for this info. And to date, we're not connected to any of them. So
okay, we're going to wrap up part 1 of Nick's story right here. So far, we've got a birthday DNA test, 2 terrified parents, and a revelation that changed everything. Not just for Nick, but for everyone connected to him. And those connections? Oh, they're coming fast. 14 half-siblings, 2 raised by the donor himself, and a family tree that is starting to look more like a spider web. In part 2, Nick digs into what happens next. The messages that started landing in his inbox, the email from the donor that was equal parts informative and also ice cold, and how he's building real relationships with some of his new siblings. It's going to be emotional and complicated, and another reminder that the truth doesn't just change your story, it expands it. It's going to be a scorcher. And remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.